There you go.
All
Okay.
right.
Hey, Jennifer. It's really nice to be with you today and talk about your awesome writing.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I wanted at first, I thought, well, we'll talk about both books, but then I just really think I'm going to have to only focus on the algorithm today because when I started to come up with questions, I realized it was hard for me to separate questions I had from the algorithm will see you now and the committee will kill you now because there are some overlapping themes. And yet they're different stories. So I thought I'm just going to stick to the algorithm because that's the one that I read first. And yeah, and then so that's what we'll stick to for now, but then we'll have a part two to delve into the other because they were both excellent reads. And so I'm just curious, because you are still a practicing oncologist, like when did you have time to write?
Great question. Um, Mostly on weekends, and I do work a little less than full time, what we call FTEs in healthcare, so 0.75. So basically, that means I have about 3 days a week to write, and Um, it was a long process, like from the time I had the idea and sat down and wrote the very first words in the very first draft to the time it was published was um about 6 years. I've been on some other podcasts where I just like to, really emphasize that I think especially if writing isn't your full-time job, like writing a book it's a long haul kind of process. Like I've never been like an athlete or run marathons, but I kind of think about like each book is definitely like a marathon mentally, I guess.
Yeah, and so on days when like when the weekend comes and you don't feel like writing, but you know that you've only got these few hours or days to do it, what do you use to like light your the momentum to get in the right headspace?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I mean, I guess I would say for the first book, I was so just enthused and excited about it that I actually mostly couldn't wait to get back to it every weekend. Um, but with the second book and then current projects, it sometimes does get a little bit harder. And so I found like a couple little things I do just to like kind of sort of trick myself into writing is and I find it's kind of like exercise. Like, so I'll tell myself, okay, I'm just going to open the document and write one sentence. It's like all I have to do is write one sentence. And then of course, once I write that one sentence, then I want to keep going. So it's just like exercise. Like if you put on, your gym shoes and get out the door, then you're gonna go on that walk or run or what. But sometimes just that first step is the hardest. Um, Another thing I've learned too from other writers, and that I wasn't doing when I first started out writing is I will stop myself before I exhaust all my ideas for the day, and then I'm excited to come back to it. And that's another little trick that is helpful because then, like, you're not opening your document and being, oh, where do I want to start today? You're like excited, like, oh yeah, I left off and I was really excited to write this part of the scene next. So that's kind of like a little trick I've learned from other writers.
And do you keep like do you write down that idea or somehow how do you remember the idea for the next day where you're not kind of like trying not to forget it? How do you let it go but still come back to it and not and be able to pick up where you left off?
Yeah, I actually will just write it like write. So I write in Microsoft Word, and so I just uh will just skip a couple lines from my draft and just write a couple sentences just to trigger my memory, or because as we all know, like with our funny brains, like you think, oh, there's no way I'd forget that, but if you don't write it down, you'll forget. So I'll even just write like, just like a few keywords so that I'll remember what I was thinking I want to have come next. So, and then when I open it back up, I'll as I start writing again, I just delete those little notes.
Right. And so I didn't discover reading until I was probably in my early to mid 20s. Actually, really not until just before I started medical school. I think I had applied and I was waiting to hear and I was working a job. And so I, pre-internet, pre-social media, didn't have people to socialize with. And I turned to reading as a way to pass time and really fell in love with it. Um, and have always had this fantasy about writing. I'm curious, but I'd never had any writing experience, and actually in school really tended toward the sciences, didn't really, aimed for the grade in, the good grades in English, but didn't really, I felt very intimidated by the written word. Were you always a writer? Have you always turned to writing as a way to, as a refuge, or are you a reader? Is writing a journal, like is writing a part of your whole life story, or did it come up later?
Oh, that's such a good question. So the lifelong reader, but the writing part came later. Um, yeah, I just since I was a little kid have been the hugest bookworm, and my mom says I basically was just one of those little kids that like taught myself to read just, from being read to, and I have memories of being like really little and like literally like sitting in the corner with a book at recess because that was much rather what I would be doing. So I think just, you know, from lifelong reading absorbed just, a lot about story and narrative, but writing really came later, and I've shared in other places, and like some of the essays I've written is it really came in my 40s, and it was when I was in a difficult place in my career and professionally, and like what I later would realize was this thing we're all calling burnout or moral injury, and was kind of lost. I left the practice of medicine for a year, and um, found just inspiration in writing personal essays, nonfiction, narrative medicine. And so I did that for a few years before I got this wild idea in my head. And I honestly still don't know where it came from, that like, I want to write a novel. And that's kind of how it all happened.
So prior to writing a novel, you had mostly written nonfiction.
Yes.
Yeah, and then we can talk about another time, but I really loved the piece that you wrote recently, about, comparing medical life to the Barbie movie, and how impossible it is to be a doctor and to be a woman and also to just be all the things. Yeah, and I was curious about, with your writing, did it feel when you were either writing nonfiction, when you were writing your essays, when you were getting an escape from whatever turmoil you were having professionally, was it like an itch or some, like, how were you drawn to writing as an outlet? Where did you even get the idea, or did it just feel like something you had to do?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And there was a specific event that inspired my first um, published personal essay, which was called Practicing Hope, and it was published in JAMA Oncology. And it was the experience of having a family member be suddenly diagnosed with an advanced cancer, and it was one of my in-laws' siblings, and so wasn't my immediate family, but as happens to us all in medicine, um, your family members reach out to you for guidance, and they were reaching out to me, and even though I felt like at that time, I'd probably been in practice for at least about 10 years, and I felt like I had really, you know, not mastered. I don't think we ever mastered, but I guess I would say I felt comfortable with my skills at talking with patients about difficult diagnoses and decisions and end of life. But the conversation I was having with my sister and brother-in-law really kind of shook my mindset because they were able to say to me in the same sentence that they totally understood that the prognosis was dire and it was terminal, but they just still wanted hope. And it really kind of like woke up my mind because I realized I was guilty of misunderstanding hope with my patients. And so as I did, because I'm this reader, I went on this deep dive in the literature, like reading about hope. Like I just really felt this burning desire, like I needed to reconcile this. Because I think it was coming from a family member, it made me realize that um, when my patients were still asking that same question, like a lot of times I think as oncologists, we were guilty of thinking they're still asking for hope for a cure, but a lot of time that's not at all what they're asking. Like hope can mean so many different things, and it's such a an an integral part of humanity. And so I can't really explain it. I just went on this deep dive and read all these different books about hope and like really thought leaders about hope. And it just kind of opened my brain, I guess. And then I felt this burning desire to share it with my colleagues. And so um, I and I remember telling my husband because, uh, of course, it got rejected several times before it got accepted somewhere, and that's just the nature of being a writer. And I think sometimes when you're a beginning writer, you don't realize that. But every time it got rejected, I was like more determined, and I went back and edited. And I remember telling my husband when I was like up late one night. I was like, I don't know why I can't stop, but I just feel like this is so important and I need to share this. And I got another rejection, but I'm revising it again. And so that was what led to my first writing experience, I guess. And I was in my early 40s. So it was that that's the story, I guess.
Well, and that leads to so many questions that I have. One is that I'm curious, did you continue submitting it to the same place, make edits and send it to them again, or did you send it to several different publications?
I sent it to several different publications, and but the one that ended up accepting it, which was JAMA Oncology, I was very grateful to the editor because he actually accepted it with recommendations for some pretty heavy edits, and I realized that I had way too much in it. It was kind of like multiple essays in one, and he helped me to really like hone it down. Um, and I think, in writing, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, usually like if you get a rejection, unless you're invited to resubmit, like usually you can't really resubmit the same piece unless unless the editor kind of indicated you could do so. So
Yeah, well, how generous for that person to
yes,
not just reject it, but to give you tips and suggestions and say, I want this, and maybe this is multiple articles, or maybe this is really to sort of send it through a sieve or a filter to kind of
yes,
pick out. But it sounds like that also built, yeah, that built a tenacity in you. There was some burning, there was something relentless inside that kept you pursuing this, which then obviously I think must have laid a great groundwork for you to continue the writing. I saw this interview with Michelle Williams, the actress. Do you remember her? Um,
hmm
she was, she's not seen a lot, but she always has really powerful performances. And I saw this little blurb about how it took her 2 years of auditions when she was trying to be an actor or be hired to get a part, and that during that time, it just really prepared her actually for life as an actress, because it was always going to be uncertain. Her next role was always going to be uncertain. Each movie would never, you'd never know what's the next script that I'll be accepted for, what next audition I'll get, next paycheck, where will it come from? And that it really solidified her identity and desire to continue doing it anyway. And so it's just great that you didn't see those. I mean, for all the rest of us reading your work, it's really great that you didn't let. And we see talks about this and advice and books about not giving up, but it's hard to not give up, especially for those of us who have been conditioned to seek approval, and reward. And when we work really hard, then we deserve to get rewarded. And when we don't, it's simply not fair and somebody else is wrong. The other thing is that your story talking about hope, must have played a pretty significant role in the role of the character Hope in The Algorithm Will See You Now. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think even though that first piece was, I think, the only personal essay that just, was a complete focus on the theme of hope. I mean, it comes up probably in all my writing, I think, because it comes up in my role every day as an oncologist. And I think, I mean, I guess it's so interesting having this conversation because I don't know that I ever consciously identified this, but I think maybe um, writing that like just helped to crystallize some things for me that would have never come about without that sort of writing journey. And I think maybe that just created this space for me where like, you and I know you do this because you coach writing and expressive writing, and somehow writing unlocks a different part of our brain. And so even like sitting down to, maybe like meditate on an idea, like you're still going to come to different realizations, I think, when you write. And so I think that most everything I write somehow has something to do with hope in it. And um, so I think that's obviously for anyone who's read the book and knows the main character, her name is Hope. So that's not very subtle at all right there, right? So, but I did want to play with this idea. So, it's set in the near future, and I had this idea of like if the medical system changes to the way some people seem to want it to, where we're really all just, these mechanical type doctors who just follow algorithms and then I kind of had this thought, well, what if it got to the point where it was so extreme that like students and residents weren't really even taught to have those difficult conversations? And then what would happen if someone was suddenly put in a role where she was having to do that? And then um, I decided, to even use symbolism and make her name Hope, because in the beginning of the book, she's someone that doesn't believe in hope. And so it just kind of all sort of went from there. So,
I'm glad that you explained that to me though too, because when I saw her name was Hope, I I was surprised as the beginning of the book and as it sort of even through the middle and really toward the until the end, that she didn't seem like a very hopeful character. I mean, she seemed like, and I don't want to have spoilers for people who haven't yet read it, but I think it's safe to say that she's on a mission that has to do with her own personal life and her relationship with her mom, who had been ill, um, and had made her own decisions about how she wanted her life to be or to end. And Hope, the character, Hope the doctor, is propelled forward in her own career by sort of trying to make it different for other people, or cancel hope altogether, because makes you it leads you into false, like the false hope, right? That what's the point? and trying to control that. And in oncology, like, well, first of all, did anyone teach you in your medical training about how to have those hard conversations with patients and about what was the way you were taught about hope, and then how did that change when you experienced it through your close family encounter?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think, when I think back to my training, so I was an oncology fellow in the mid 2000s. And then of course, before that, I had done 3 years of residency and 4 years of medical school before that. So this is kind of mid 90s to mid 2000s era. Most of, I think, how we were taught was if we were lucky enough to have a good mentor or attending that modeled it for us. And then we tried to emulate that, right? Um, I mean, we had some talks probably more like by social workers. Like I can't ever remember like having like a medical talk where we all sat down and it was more, and I think that's how like a lot of medical training is, right? We have this old mantra like see one, do one, teach one. like like you're just expected to pick it up, come on, pick it up. like um so I think that's thankfully changed a lot over the last 25 years. But no, and also because I was like a lot of people from our generation who are doctors, really went the straight path of like, I was a biochemistry major and then I went to medical school and then, I just went through it all. So, um, but since, I've always had this love of reading, I think, sort of like the humanities part of it was just things I was doing on my own. And so, I don't think that was ever anything formalized that I can think of. I think then in my third year of fellowship, where you get a little bit time, to do electives, I think one of the most impactful things on me as an oncologist was actually my palliative care rotation. Um, the palliative care attendings did teach, they do have some great tools of, how you talk with people in difficult circumstances. And then later in my years of practice, if I was struggling with a patient and having a tough communication situation, my go-to person is always the social worker. And so I've learned a lot of tools from social workers. So hopefully it's better nowadays for trainees. But sorry, that was a long answer to your question. That no, I don't
No.
think I got a lot of formal instruction. I don't think any of us really did.
No, and that's
Yeah,
kind of where I'm going with
yeah,
this because I certainly
yeah,
did. And I don't remember anyone. It was kind of a implied that, of course, you know how to be nice or be sensitive, but m
yeah.
most people actually don't know how to do that. Um, and hide behind intellectualism as a form of armor to keep the distance from it. And we're taught to protect ourselves, to not become too empathetic and take on keep distance. And I think certainly I get the sense that you and I both know how important compassion is, and that hope is making room for anything to be possible, and to um, I think that makes me think of just medical training in general, and the medical hierarchy, and just following suit and modeling. You mentioned, you might have some mentor, somebody that you try to emulate. And I'm in this book and in your other book, there's definitely the hierarchy of trainees, and where you are if you're an intern versus a med student, intern versus resident, higher chief resident, and an attending. And there's definitely those dynamics in this. And how, based on your lived experience and maybe some of the characters' experience, that medical hierarchy, how effective is it, do you think, in making good doctors?
Ooh, what an interesting question. I don't know how to answer that. I got to think on that. I mean, I think it
Yeah,
is.
and I don't want to put you on
a-
the spot, but it's
No,
just
no,
something I
I
think about
love
a
it.
lot because I feel like
Yeah,
it's these vertical power structures that
yeah.
keep everybody obedient and in line and scared. Um, and then I just wonder how that erodes. Well, I'm really into the power paradox, which is something I read about probably about 10 years ago. Dr. Keltner is the head of he's a psychology professor at UC Berkeley who also founded the Greater Good Science Center, which I love to read their newsletter. And he wrote a book many years ago called The Power Paradox, which describes that many people, well, the principle is that we're born inherently compassionate and that we often gain power through our most compassionate acts. And then upon feeling powerful, we use that power in arrogant or unethical ways.
Mhm.
And that power then erodes compassion, um, which then leads to all sorts of moral and ethical dilemmas in healthcare, because especially now that healthcare is a corporation, um, back to where we were saying, like, is compassion something that should be taught? Is it something we should be selecting for in medical admissions as opposed to like who can score the highest on the exam? Because now with what you talk about in the book with artificial intelligence, um, it's going to be not far. It's already not far off that you can just look up the answer to a lot of things, and there will be all sorts of algorithms and protocols and ways to just code a person and what it's most likely to do, and it'll spit out what should be done. And that people, you won't be the hero, the one who knows the right answer. The computer will be the hero. So then the role of the human is going to have to be something else. And we see in your book what happens to people like Mara. Is that how you pronounce her name?
Mhm.
Mara?
Mara, yes.
Mara. Who has really just taken almost a robotic position, is being very guarded and not having really a lot of human qualities. And Hope is somewhere in between. And then the intern, I forgot her name.
JC.
Casey is the one who still has it
Yeah.
and has a personal reason for having it, and also has a lot of knowledge that Hope can gain from learning from someone lower in the hierarchy, right? So I can't remember exactly where I'm going with this, except to say the hierarchy plays a huge role in medical life. And I think it's in this book. And then I wonder, do you see it as just the way things are, or what would it be like in medicine if we didn't have that, if it was just more of a horizontal power structure?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. And I even make this comparison in the book. It's kind of like the military, right? Like there is a reason for safety in some ways for the hierarchy. Um, but does that mean, like you were just saying, that the person at the bottom of the hierarchy doesn't sometimes have more value to offer or a unique idea than someone at the top? And so, um, I I mean, and maybe, that's a lot of reason I was driven to write the book because there isn't an easy answer. Um, I think that, certainly when I think back to my training, which I will say even as hard as it was sometimes, and like looking back now, I can see like all the ways it was traumatic. Like at the time, I like loved it. Like I was doing what I had, set out to do from a young age, with this goal in mind. Um, and I thought it was fantastic. I thought I was like in the elite that look at me, I'm working 36 hours without sleep. Like I am special, you know? And that's like anyone listening to this who's not in medicine right now probably thinks this sounds insane, but that, and it's really only when you're outside it that you look back and are like, maybe that really wasn't like the safest thing for me or my peers or the patients. And so, and then when you think about it, it's like, why is it this way? Well, it's because not only are residents there to learn and take care of patients, but they're there to keep the system running. They get paid pennies, when you break down pennies by the hour, basically. And the healthcare system, uses them essentially. So uh, it's very complicated, as you know also, and any physician who's been through the U.S. healthcare training system. And I think, and that's what I get into a little bit more in my second book. And I know we're not going to go there too much today, but I did want to sort of highlight the history of like, how did all these things happen, and then how did we get work hour restrictions, and sort of what were some of the pivotal events that led to that, and um so yeah, I don't have the answer. I think there has to
I
be
don't expect
obviously
you to
some.
have the answer,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's something I never questioned, until I stepped away from medical practice. I mean, I still work remotely a few hours a day, but I'm not a part of that, and I'm not in an academic institution or a training institution. So with some distance, I think not just time, but distance to really step back and think, was that really helpful? And did it create? And I think my personal experience is that the people that graduate at the top of the medical school class don't necessarily make the best doctors, um, because there's a real difference between being able to really be with someone who's ill versus get the right answer. And then in real life, there is no right answer most often, where it's
Yeah.
just educated guesses. And then sort of this competition for who are people going to believe has the right answer? And that person has the power, at least temporarily. And, you say in the book, you talk about the prayer of Maimonides. Is that how you pronounce it? Okay.
Yes, I
And
think
you,
that's how I've heard it anyway.
okay, I'm just going by like
Yeah.
limited phonetics, but you had taught, at the beginning of one of the chapters, you had included that, and it really caught me, because this is obviously an old um text, or quote. Do not allow thirst for profit, ambition, for renown and admiration to interfere with my profession, for these are the enemies of truth and of love for mankind, and they can lead astray in the great task of attending to the welfare of thy creatures. And so I was wondering, like, when did you first encounter that prayer? And did you include it because it was um, the way that you were you seeing it being played out, or were you seeing it being ignored?
Oh, yeah. Oh, so gosh, I don't remember for sure, but I think actually it was a long time ago, like in residency, I think. And I think it was actually some sort of like small group session or lecture where someone was it was discussion about the Hippocratic Oath and all and alternatives. And So I had known about it for a long time, just learning about it at some point in my training. But I will tell you, like the very first draft of this book, I actually basically had a couple lines from the Oath and Prayer of Maimonides at the top of every chapter. Um, and I had something like, like 35 or 36 chapters, and I just broke it all up. And um, then as the years went on, and I was trying to find a publisher, and I was getting lots and lots of rejections. I scaled it back because I thought, well, maybe it was too much. And so I have now just just a quote at the beginning of each, so Act One, Act Two, and Act Three of the book. So, um, um, but yeah, it was just kind of this like literary tool, like when I first was writing that it actually was kind of remarkable how like not even trying to match like the quote up with each chapter, like I just, chunked it out. And then because obviously a lot of the themes are about medical ethics, then um it kind of fit the story no matter where it was.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and to be honest, I don't think I'd encountered it before. Maybe I had, because it sort of sounds familiar, but to read it again at this point in my life from this vantage point and looking in the past, just feels like, yeah, we've really deviated from that. And that there were people even way back when who were recognizing beware, because they could recognize how it could be used in maladaptive or unhealthy ways. And yet we haven't heeded, you know, the the warnings and and I think I'm not against, I don't mean that in the sense that of artificial intelligence, right? I think I'm meaning it in terms of just medical culture, how medical culture has strayed from some of those basic tenets of
Yeah.
not just first do no harm, but to stay in your lane of morals and ethics and be careful not to let it go to your head, the power that you wield. But many of us didn't listen.
Yeah.
Um, so this idea of artificial intelligence, are you already encounter it's not an idea, it's a reality. Are you already encountering it in your daily work?
Um, we are not so much in oncology, except for, I mean, as you know, in radiology, probably the main place I see it is uh, just sort of the over reading or double reading of the mammograms, which I think is actually a great example of how it can be used for the good of patients because it's and again, you as a radiologist would know better than me, but my understanding is it's not trying to do the radiologist's job. It's just trying to point out things that might be too small for the human eye and bringing that to the attention of the radiologist and then the radiologist is still interpreting that and because maybe it's just an artifact or what have you. And so it's not like the patient's getting a report from, the machine learning algorithm that's overreading the digital mammogram. But I mean, there is a lot of excitement in oncology, and I talk about this in my author's note in the back of the book, is kind of how I um, got so fascinated with artificial intelligence in oncology is that um, in the 2010s, like so the previous decade, there was a lot of interest in IBM's Watson in oncology, basically to try to, um, you know, spit out a treatment plan basically like we would feed all the information to the algorithm and then it would say this is what your treatment should be. And I think it came from really some good places that, of course, being humans in an overworked system, and the more and more data we are getting every year as we learn how to do more and more testing on tumors and molecular testing and DNA mutations, like we never want to miss something, right? We never want to miss something that could help a patient. And so um, if it worked, that would be fantastic. But the thing that happened with IBM's Watson is it actually like failed spectacularly. And I was kind of following this along because I just found it fascinating. I think, again, I don't know if I mentioned this, but like my undergrad was biochemistry, and so is just very fascinating to me. And then when it all just kind of fizzled away, I got curious, like, wait a minute, what happened to this whole Watson thing? And there's a couple big tech reporters that if you just Google, you'll see, I think his name is Casey Newton. Like he's done a series of articles about like what went wrong with it. And um uh but like in the medical space, like it wasn't really being talked about. And so um there are now a lot of people that are still kind of looking at, well, okay, so Watson didn't work, but the next AI is going to. And so I guess like that's kind of like the basic idea of where my book came from is I thought, well, um, okay, what if we had an AI that could actually do what they wanted it to do, but what if the people behind it weren't really um didn't have such good intentions, basically. Um, and I think again, it's just this inherent clash that we all experience with um, trying to be healers, but we're working in a system that wants us to be like a corporate widget, right? So it's like it's such an inherent conflict. Like, so that's kind of where all the ideas came from. And so, yes, there's still like you can just go online and find lots of people talking about the next AI. I think, whether it's going to be Google's or somebody else's that, uh, they're looking at with oncology. So, it's not something that's being done on a day-to-day basis yet, but people are trying.
Yeah, and I read I don't think yeah, I have it here, this book Deep Medicine by Eric Topol. Have you heard of it?
Mhm.
Did you read it?
I have read parts of it.
Okay. I read it over the summer and it's not even a new release, but something led me to it. And just really talking about all the ways that artificial intelligence will really be amazing in revolutionizing so much of medicine. We're being more individualized medicine and really targeting things that will help an individual. And I think for me, what gets me excited, because radiology will probably be one of the first areas that's really replaced, because I actually don't read mammograms, but there's a ton of AI being used in mammography, and then also other disciplines of radiology where I think ultimately the computer will be able to do it better than people, and there will be a real. I think there's already a lot of people working to not become irrelevant or unnecessary to be part of that movement so that they don't get left behind and can still feel useful and integral to that service. But as I mentioned earlier, I get excited when I think about if the computer gets the credit for finding the critical information, then maybe the role of doctors won't be to be the ones who get to the glory of the discovery or the accolades for making the right diagnosis. And it will be more that we really need people who can convey empathy, compassion, to sit with people who are in struggle, to normalize tears, to be able to normalize struggle and not pathologize it, and to be
Mhm.
able to have that the skill of having a difficult conversation or not even dispelling or telling someone what they should or shouldn't do, or that the algorithm has said this, but like, okay, now what do we want to do with that? The
Yeah.
algorithm is saying this, it doesn't mean you can't have hair. It means like, what do you want to do with this information? How do you want to respond to that? And so I like to envision, if I ever became obsolete as a radiologist, which I sort of admittedly feel like I am already obsolete since I do it so little anymore. But I think I would really enjoy playing that role of interpreting, of being with people in that murkiness of, okay, this is what all the predictions say, because there's still always going to be this element of uncertainty, no matter
Hmm.
what everything predicts, because
Right.
people's prognosis change all the time, right? And people say it's a miracle, or they did a vegan diet, or there was a, some miraculous, right? All these targeted therapies where someone went from you have 4 weeks to live to you're cured. I mean, advances are really, really remarkable. And I don't know, it excites. I think I feel like it's at this time where people feel like humanity is at risk because of digital age. My hope is that there's enough momentum of energy around staying human that
Hmm.
it'll be almost like the Enlightenment or some other Renaissance period where people are recreating the things that are rediscovering the things that made life so amazing to begin with, because the some of the thinking of the things that we've been thinking about we won't be thinking about them as much. It'll be a different direction that we're using that information and what to do with it and how to speak about it. And that will be exciting, and that we have curiosity around that, and it'll feel like this pioneering um frontier. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I love all of that, and just the hope and optimism that um the people making those stakeholder decisions will realize the importance of that. And I think too, for me, I practice in a rural area. I've been there for a little over a decade. That it's I think sometimes maybe the people in the conference rooms, the C-suite behind closed doors, like they think that all we do as doctors is like just, tell people a diagnosis and a prescription and here you go. And, that's the easiest part of it, right? Like, because um, nowadays, a lot of people um, don't trust what we say, and they're not going to trust what a computer says. And um, one of the things I've found, like when I've done some interviews about uncertainty in oncology practice, that the number one thing that I find I need in order to um, get buy-in from a patient on a treatment plan is trust. Like it doesn't really, like, you can't go anywhere if you don't have that trust. And so a lot of times if someone is mistrustful, like I'll just see them like, every week or every other week just to talk, and just until we get to that level of trust. And I think, that's what I worry about a lot when I think about these sort of possible futures and technology, is that who's going to get left out and get left behind uh, if the human element isn't kept there. And like you're saying, like I think that would be a very um, utopian reality, and I know Dr. Topol has a very utopian view of AI, and I think that would be fantastic. I unfortunately have a lot of lived experience that makes me worry it might not turn out that way. And I think a lot of the decisions are being made without clinicians, without the doctors in practice right now, and that really scares me. I think, just because someone has an MD on their name, if they haven't seen patients in 20 years, like you need to actively practicing, MD or DO. I just mean like, a clinician. So, um, I, I fear we as the, sort of frontline practicing physicians who understand what is involved on the human level of people making these decisions are being left out of this. And that's very frightening to me.
Well, and to comfort you in that fear, I really do think that your book, while it's fiction, that the material really brings to light a lot of things that people outside of healthcare and people inside of healthcare don't recognize, or they're not allowing themselves to see it. Either they don't see it, or they don't want to see it, or they don't recognize it, or they don't know that they don't know what they don't know. And that's why I think like your book is so important, because even though I really devoured it like it was just a juicy, yummy, fun read, it actually just made me think about a lot of things that it helped, it reminded me of a lot of things, and also just illuminated things that it made me feel excited for some of these truths, these experiences, these struggles, these tensions to be made visible in a way that's different than a journal article, or an interview, or even a work of nonfiction, because that can be just the same way that you can learn so much from a dramatic arts, from a play or a movie where you're seeing it. I think that fiction, the way that you've written this, educates us. It's not just a frivolous, even though it is a fun read, there's a lot of depth to it. And I think it's apparent that you put that you shaped it somehow with some intention, and you did play with it and you did have fun with it, is how I felt it. And that you are healing in this way. And because of your experience working firsthand with people in rural medicine, I want to echo and amplify this, that people cannot be left behind. And that certainly is a theme in this book about those with privilege to receive the care, those who the algorithm allowed in, who were accidentally left out of the algorithm, or the algorithm failed and they were left out, or that people, just because you didn't meet the algorithm doesn't mean you don't deserve care. Things that just really were very much, although the work was fiction, were very much reality based things that are confronting our world inside and outside of medicine at this time. Inside and outside of, there's more than just the COVID pandemic. There are a lot of pandemics and beliefs that are circulating that are deadly right now. And I think that you managed to gracefully include a lot of difficult social dilemmas in the book, which may or may not have been intentional, but it was there.
Well, thank you. It's just always so rewarding to, I mean, as a new author, I mean, that was my very first published book. So I, when it was first published, I was afraid, like, first of all, will anyone even read it? And second of all, will, people understand what the intention was? And so it's just very rewarding as a author to get that kind of feedback. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for writing it. And I look forward to talking again about your next book, which was The Committee Will Kill You Now, because I think there's a lot to discuss regarding gaslighting, and also why do people enter medicine to begin with, and what keeps us there, even if it's not going well, and also just the psychological manipulation and lack of psychological safety in medicine, for obviously for patients, but really for practitioners as well. So I look forward to our next conversation about that.
Me too. I feel like we could talk for hours, so we probably should save it for
I
a part
know,
two.
I know. Well, I'm gonna we'll send it on, sign off the recording. Um, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.